Welcome to The Cutting Floor, a weekly podcast of West Cannon Baptist Church. Hi, I'm Emily, and with me is Pastor Zach. This week, your sermon covered Genesis 28. Is there an allusion to the Exodus in the events of Jacob's life and going away from the promised land and then returning to it?
I think that there is, and I think this is actually a developing and consistent theme in Moses' narration of the book of Genesis. We have to remember, of course, the audience to whom Moses is compiling this narrative history is for the generation of Israelites who are currently wandering in the wilderness at the time of Moses' writing of these events. And so Moses is recording these true events of history, but he is recording and highlighting particular details that he sees that God had arranged and providentially orchestrated in the lives of the patriarchs that would have correspondences in the nation of Israel's future history. So God, in the affairs of the lives of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the events of their lives have many features that God would then later revisit, we'll say, in the history of Israel. Moses picks up on some of these, and he is clearly highlighting them in his presentation of the lives of the patriarchs. So we have God saying to Jacob that he is about to go out of the land of promise for a time, in this particular case to get a wife, but God promises him that I will bring you back to the land of promise. And this echoes back to a promise that God made to Abraham back in Genesis 15, that I'm going to give you all of this land, not only to you, but to your descendants after you. They will, for 400 years, go live in a foreign land, but I will bring them back to this land. That is the current experience of the people to whom Moses is writing. They're the ones who are returning to the land after the 400-year absence of their parents and grandparents from the land of promise. Jacob's own life mirrors or really foreshadows what this is going to look like. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this more in the coming sermons, but in the book of Hosea sees this correspondence, and in chapter 12 mentions that Jacob, or Israel, sought a wife and for years was away from the land of promise, but that God brought him back. And then the prophet Hosea makes a connection between that event in Jacob's life and the future exodus of Israel. So Moses is picking up on all of these facts in the patriarchs' lives. He's seeing a correspondence to Israel's own experience in the Exodus, and he's intentionally fronting or highlighting those details so that the current people of Israel can read back in the lives of the patriarchs and say, we share that experience, and see how God was faithful to the patriarchs. Well, God is also going to be faithful to us.
How do we know that Esau was not trying to spite his parents by marrying an Ishmaelite woman rather than trying to win their favor?
You know, it is interesting as we look at Esau's relationship with his parents to wonder, he clearly has animosity toward Jacob, but does any of this animosity spill over toward mom and dad? And is potentially this marriage with an Ishmaelite a means of kind of poking his parents out of anger and frustration over the fact that he's been passed over for the blessing and the birthright? But I think as we read Genesis 28 carefully, I think what we see pretty clearly is that this is a last-ditch, desperate attempt to reclaim the favored position that he perceives himself as having lost. We read in chapter 28 that Esau sees that Isaac has blessed Jacob again, so that the Jacob is sort of cemented onto Jacob. And then he notices that Jacob is instructed by Isaac not to get a wife from the Canaanite women, that Jacob obeys his father and mother and then goes to Padan Aram to go procure this wife from Abraham's family through Abraham's brother Nahor's family. And then we read in verse 8, so Esau saw that the Canaanite women did not please his father. Then Esau goes to Ishmael. So the motivating factor for not marrying another Canaanite woman, but rather a woman who's related to Abraham in some way, is because Esau sees that these Canaanite women don't please his parents. And so rather than going and doubling down on getting another wife from the Hittites, he actually tries to go procure a wife from Abraham's family. But again, because of Esau's hard-heartedness, his stubbornness, his being driven by his passions and the fact that sin has a way of blinding us to reality, he fails to properly account for the fact that Ishmael is not the branch of Abraham's family to go get a wife from. Ishmael is outside of the blessings. Ishmael cursed the blessed son Isaac, who happens to be Esau's dad, who Esau's trying to please. So this just seems to be another in a series of events in Esau's life where he is grossly miscalculating how to obtain the blessing. And as a result, Esau is going to continue to flounder and for the next few decades sort of pass out of the story. And then when he returns into it, he is again not going to be the one who the birthright and the blessing will flow through. That has passed him by. And so this episode is, I think, in some ways pathetic, and I mean that in the sense of it produces our pathos or our emotion. It's another episode of Esau crying out, "Is there not even some blessing for me? Bless me also, my father." And yet, despite his best attempts to win favor, through his own selfishness, through his own pursuit of his desires, the blessing and the birthright have passed him by.
In verses 20 through 22, is Jacob essentially saying he will only believe God if God is true to his promises? Isn't that a legitimate condition for faith?
Right, so God appears in this dream to Jacob, and in that dream, God gives blessings and promises to Jacob. And really, these are the reiterations or the reinstantiations of the blessings and the promises that have been given to Abraham. And God is identifying Jacob as Abraham's rightful heir, so to speak, that all the things that have been promised to Abraham will go through Isaac and now through Jacob, rather than Esau. And then Jacob responds with, "If God will help me and keep me in this way that I will go and give me bread to eat and clothing to wear so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God." Now, if you read a lot of older commentators, particularly in the patristics or in the kind of Puritan eras of the church, when they commentate on this passage, a lot of them are willing to give Jacob a great deal of the benefit of the doubt and to argue that Jacob's vow is just an expression of his faith in God. That he's saying, if God does what he says he will do, and because I believe he will do what he says he will do, then God is therefore going to be my God. But I think that is not only a overly generous interpretation in favor of Jacob, but I think it really fails to account for the broader literary context of what we see going on in Jacob's life. The next few episodes in Jacob's life, we're going to see Jacob behaving still in ungodly ways. We're going to see him caving, capitulating, and even perpetuating some kind of cultish fertility practices. We're going to see him in his negotiations and dealings with his future father-in-law Laban, particularly in relation to the flocks and herds. He seems to be engaged in almost witch doctor practices about how he is trying to grow his herds over and against his father-in-law's herds, rather than recognizing that what's happening is the Lord blessing him. He's trying to find some sort of witch practice-y kind of ways of explaining or reasonable explanations for what's happening. So Jacob is not somebody who is living in right relationship with God. And in fact, on the way back into the land, we're going to have this episode of Jacob wrestling all night with the Lord. And I think that that's really the moment in which God really brings Jacob to heel, so to speak, and makes Jacob a worshiper of God, where Jacob really submits himself to the Lord. That hasn't happened yet. And so within Moses' own narration of the rest of Jacob's life, the moment of real repentance and submission for Jacob is still to come. I think really what we have is an ongoing feature of Jacob's life, which is that he's a negotiator. He's a deal maker. He's a guy who's out for number one. He's going to try to make a deal with Laban, and he's going to find in Laban a counterpart that is his equal or more in deception and deal making. But that's the feature of Jacob's life. And so I think we need to read this if-then clause or vow of Jacob's at its face value. Jacob is not willing yet to submit himself to God. He is conditioning his future obedience and submission to God on the basis of what God will or will not do for him. And it's because Jacob has a low view of God that Jacob views himself in an exalted position, as though he is equal to the task of bartering with God in the way that he barters with all of his human counterparts.
How do we balance God's promises to bless his people against the temptation to have a demanding attitude like Jacob?
We do, of course, throughout the scriptures see many examples of God promising blessing on those who follow him, who love him, on those who are his people. And yet we need to recognize and hold in tension that these instantiations of blessing in the text, some of them are connected to Old Testament covenant, wherein keeping the covenant would result in tangible physical blessings, particularly in living in peace in the land of promise, and bringing over those promises in a one-for-one sense into the new covenant, and saying that we should expect material blessings and peace if we keep the terms of the covenant that Christ has made with his people, is not realistic, particularly when Christ himself in the Great Commission, not the Great Commission, on the Sermon on the Mount, says that if you are mistreated for the sake of righteousness, you should rejoice and be glad, for in the same way the people of God and the people of the surrounding nations, they mistreated all of the forerunners of Christ, all of the prophets. And so if you, for the sake of Christ, suffer for righteousness, that's actually a signifier as part of the new covenant people that we are doing the right. All who live godly will suffer persecution, the New Testament authors tell us. So we shouldn't expect our lives, if we are actually living in the midst of a world that hates Christ, if we're living as people who proclaim Christ and who are in our lives exemplify Christ, we shouldn't expect it's all going to be sunshine and rainbows, right? There is going to be real persecution. I think we need to have a mind less like Jacob, that is so fixated on material things, the food in his stomach, the clothes on his back, the peace in his life. And we need to have more of the mind of Abraham, who receives these same blessings, but rather than becoming fixated on the material fulfillment of these promises, we read, as the author of Hebrews tells us, he lived his whole life looking and anticipating a better country, that is a heavenly one. And it says, therefore God was not ashamed to be called his God. And what does that mean? Well, all throughout the rest of the scriptures, we read that I am the God of Abraham, right? So God identifies himself as the God in relation to this man, which is this amazing condescension on God's part to tie his own character to the character of what we know to be a very flawed person in Abraham's life. But God does this out of his great love and friendship for Abraham because of Abraham's great faith. Abraham is the prototype man of faith in the Old Testament. He's the man who believes God, and God counts it to him as righteousness. And even in believing God's promises, Abraham sees the greater spiritual fulfillment that's to come rather than the more immediate material fulfillment that Jacob and others seem to be looking for. Abraham is looking for that heavenly city. That should be the orientation of Christians, that while we rejoice in every good gift that God gives, as he gives good gifts to his children in our own lifetime, and we're thankful for those things, the greater fulfillment of God's promises await the day in which the heavenly city comes, and we dwell as God's people with him for eternity and experience for the rest of time, for all time, the great blessings of the one who gave his life for us and brought us as the blood-bought bride for the marriage supper of the Lamb that will initiate an eternal day of rest for the people of God.
If you have any questions from the sermon or the sermon passage that you would like to have answered on the podcast, please email them by 8 a.m. on Tuesday morning to questions@westcannon.org. We'll see you next week.